Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision, the standards, and the culture of healthcare systems. If you want to join in the conversation or learn more about activating physician leadership, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or even leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear from you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. This is Patty Fay. This episode will be the first of 4 dedicated to a topic that's an ever-present reminder that there's something very wrong in the medical profession. This is about the commoditization of physicians, the subordination of physician career to a business school mindset and to business, not patient care interests. This is about burnout. There's a lot out there on this topic, and not surprisingly, the term itself has become radioactive. I'll talk about why in a few minutes. But first, what is burnout? The World Health Organization established a definition of it for the 11th revision of the International Classifications of Diseases, ICD-11, which will be published in 2022. Here is that definition. Burnout is an occupational phenomenon with 3 dimensions: energy depletion or exhaustion, feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. So about 50% of physicians suffer from burnout, which is caused by negative or toxic work environments. It's devastating. It disrupts relationships, emotionally distances physicians when they most need support from their families and colleagues. It erodes a physician's confidence and increases the risk for substance abuse, malpractice claims, and suicidal ideation. The effect of physician burnout on healthcare and healthcare systems is immeasurable. Physician work is reduced by every mechanism, from decreased discretionary effort by an exhausted doctor to death by suicide that swallows up entire families. Patients are harmed in all degrees, from an indifferent stare by a patient's long-term physician to medical error that does devastating harm. First of all, it's critical to latch on to the fact that burnout by definition is an occupationally induced syndrome. It's nothing that doctors bring with them into the workplace. Since about half of all physicians suffer from burnout, there's a good chance that you can describe what it feels like, and if you escaped, you might be able to describe what it felt like after you left the toxic environment. The vast majority of us return to our normal, loving, engaged self, or whatever kind of self we are. It's that bright yellow canary that heads whistling into the coal mine. A little while later, it flutters out gasping and soot-covered. If our metaphorical canary escapes the toxic exposure, it has a full recovery, regardless of whether it had a weekend resilience seminar. I'm going to jump the gun here and ask if you'd tell me if you've had an experience in a dysfunctional workplace. Tell me what you noticed at work and what you noticed after you left. My email, as well as a voicemail app, is on my webpage at license2leadpodcast.com. So my bias is that the main driver of burnout among physicians is lack of autonomy. And this is the autonomy that our patients and the public expect of us. It's the autonomy that's packaged up with our medical license and handed to us along with our fiduciary responsibility to serve our patients and not others. My other bias about burnout is that the majority of healthcare leaders have proven that they're not capable of resolving or caring about one of the most important issues in healthcare. Physician burnout affects all the stakeholders in healthcare, all of them, from nurses and technicians and pharmacists to administrators and insurance companies, hospital boards, and certainly patients. If anything would help the CEO prick up his ears, or the executive who will get a bonus based on financial performance, you'd really think it would be the financial windfall of reducing physician burnout. How strategic is a CFO who doesn't put a 50% or even a 15% reduction of physician burnout at the top of her year-end goals? Anyway, bottom line, in case you only have 5 minutes to listen, we need to replace healthcare leaders who have not effectively tackled the toxic factors which produce burnout. The toxicity emanates from the executive team because organizational culture starts at the top. I'm going to tackle burnout in a series of 4 podcasts. This one, episode number 4, will cover the definition, the controversies, and the data. Episode 5 will turn and take a look at the impact of burnout on people and organizations and finances. I'll include some observations and recommendations along the way. In episode 6, I'll zero in on burnout, autonomy, and neuroscience. This is where I'll spend some time clarifying why a deficit of physician autonomy is one of the most fundamental problems in healthcare. Even as you listen to this podcast and the next few, consider how different it would be if our hospitals and health systems were run by highly accomplished, universally respected, technically superb physicians. Episode 7 will be the last in the Burnout series, and I'll dive into the special role played by the electronic health record, the EHR. And then, to get that taste out of my mouth, I'll present a case study about leadership that gives us some hope for what the medical profession and healthcare leadership could look like. Let's go on and get started with part 1. Part 1, what is burnout and how is it measured? Christina Maslach, a professor emeritus at Berkeley, developed a career-long interest in burnout starting back in 1976, and she developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, or MBI. She's a practical and engaging speaker, so you can hear about burnout straight from Maslach's mouth if you check out her lectures and keynote speeches on YouTube. She describes burnout as an occupationally specific dysphoria, a syndrome caused by a damaging work environment. Her Maslach Burnout Inventory, or MBI, is a 22-item questionnaire divided into 3 domains. The first is exhaustion. This is usually characterized as emotional exhaustion, and it's widely recognized as the core domain of burnout. An example is, I feel like my work is breaking me down. The second domain is cynicism, also called depersonalization. It's a loss of caring about your work, your colleagues, or patients. An example is, I really don't care about what happens to some of my patients. When we depersonalize another person, we dehumanize them. It opens the door for us to treat someone in a way that violates our own values. I think this is the component that's most associated with the concept of moral injury. When we depersonalize someone, we don't see the dad or the beloved spouse. We see the glioblastoma in bed 4 or the overdose in the OBS unit. A cynical person would say, I don't care about these people. None of this matters. The third domain of the MBI is inefficacy. The word inefficacy and the concept is a little hard to hang on to, but it's referring to a sense of reduced professional efficacy. Someone feels incompetent and like they've made the wrong career choice. An example of one of the items in this domain is, I accomplish many worthwhile things in this job. So someone who has a reduced sense of efficacy would be inclined to say, I'm bad at this. I just don't belong here. Each of the 3 domains are scored separately. They're not combined into a total. It's thought that results in each domain has its own relevance for what the individual is experiencing or which workplace factors might be driving the burnout or what intervention could be useful. There are a half a dozen or so other burnout assessments, but about 90% of the research uses the Maslach Burnout Inventory or some proprietary version of the MBI. The Maslach tool is so pervasive that one researcher quipped that the definition of burnout is what the MBI measures. Maslach describes what she calls strategic areas that are relevant to burnout, and her 6 strategic areas are workload, control, rewards, community, fairness, and values. These areas are related to what I'll talk about in the Burnout, Autonomy, and Neuroscience podcast, number 6, when I talk about interpersonal motivators that can either threaten or reward people. Maslach says that workload is usually the first thing people think about when it comes to burnout, but she said that the other 5 areas are just as critical. It depends on the organization, and it can depend on what's most important to an individual. A drum that I've beat for over 20 years is that physicians aren't necessarily overworked. They're over-frustrated. Now, that's too simplistic and just a big fat lie for some situations. But my point is that physicians have an enormous capacity for work. And I think physician resilience is superb. That's why the idea of resilience training is exasperating. Who would be more resilient than these academic Navy SEALs who can carry enormous responsibilities and carry out critical duties while sleep deprived? Recently, the physician capacity for work has been high profile around the world during the COVID crisis. It's clear that physician burnout is not about the volume of work. It's about leadership, capability, priorities, and decisions. Burnout is about the lens of leadership. Is it on supporting people and the profession and the patients, or is it focused on monitoring, controlling, and finances? Anyway, back to Maslach's 6 areas. She says people can tolerate issues in some of the 6 areas without experiencing burnout, as long as there are some solid matches in areas that are most important to an individual. So again, the 6 areas are, number 1, workload. This one is certainly relevant to medicine. This is the classic imbalance between too many demands and too few resources to get it done. I think of that I Love Lucy episode where Lucy is working in a candy factory boxing up chocolates, and the conveyor belt speeds up more and more until Lucy decompensates and is just throwing candy around willy-nilly. Yeah, it's like that, only we have patients coming at us, humans in their most vulnerable moments. Okay, so workload is the first one. And there's a lot more nuance and fascinating, relevant neuroscience related to workload that's also critical to burnout in medicine. Number 2, control. This is autonomy, having choices, control, and power to affect your work environment. Maslach makes the point that there's a clear link between lack of control and burnout. Again, more on this in episode 6, where autonomy is the star of the show. Number 3 is rewards. Nope. Not talking about incentives here. Rewards means there is something, anything positive that comes out of the work. If a great day at work is a day when nothing bad happens, that's a big problem in the rewards department. This is the subject of so much research, and the emphasis is not on the paycheck. It's on a core need to be seen as a contributor, to be appreciated for our work. It's a huge red flag if people in an organization are left to wonder, does my work even matter to anyone around here? The 4th one is community. This means I've got my tribe. The Gallup organization talks about the importance of having a best friend at work. It's one of the top 12 drivers of employee engagement. Having a community or a sense of connectedness or belonging is an amazing motivator. It can make up for a lot of deficiencies in the workplace. The stories related to the teamwork, the sense of mission, the community in the hospitals during the COVID outbreak are inspiring examples. Having a great sense that someone has my back can mitigate work stress. The 5th one is fairness. Am I being treated fairly, or do the raises and desirable schedules seem to favor the in crowd? This fairness definition is broad, and it includes things like, are the work assignments a match with my skills, or are they illegitimate? Illegitimate work means expectations and tasks which are above or below my skill set. Does any of that sound familiar in light of research that shows doctors spend 2 hours doing clerical and administrative tasks like data entry for every 1 hour of patient contact time? And when it comes to fairness, it's not just about me. We are affected by seeing others treated unfairly. And the last one, number 6, is values. Does the organization operate within a set of values that is consistent with my values? Does that mission and values statement framed in the hallway say patients first, but all the behavior seems to be finances first? Does it say we treat everyone with respect, but au contraire, no, we don't? If your values have to swim upstream to stay alive in a toxic workplace, it causes burnout. If you value quality care and evidence-based medicine, but you're being monitored and rewarded for throughput and maximal revenue capture, then this is a values conflict. And this would predict that element of burnout called moral injury. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So that's the overview of the Maslach burnout inventory and the 6 areas that Maslach thinks are most relevant when assessing burnout risk. And next up, I'll talk about some of the burnout controversies. Part 2, controversies. So, what's so controversial about burnout? Well, the word itself has become radioactive. The term has almost become synonymous with blaming physicians for their lack of self-care and resilience and resourcefulness. This is a masterful sleight of hand by those who control the direction, the dollars, and the microphones in our healthcare institutions. Burnout has been used to implicate those with the syndrome as being the source of the problem. The word burnout throws out the red carpet for wellness solutions that imply a physician deficiency, yoga, journaling, and resilience training. When the actual source of the problem is a leadership disconnected from the core business and indifferent to the forces harming physicians and others. This bias to blame the canary rather than fix the toxic coal mine is a big reason the burnout statistics have remained abysmal for years. So little wonder people recoil at the word burnout and want to replace it with a term that hasn't been appropriated by wellness consultants and administrators. Various powerful entities have a lot to lose if they have to repair the upstream causes. Just think of the cost of actually fixing the harmful and financially driven demands on physicians. Think of the cost of things like fixing the EHR, unraveling the pay for performance measures that harm patients rather than help them, just saying no to predatory maintenance of certification demands, and mitigating or refusing to play the game of prior authorization. And what if health systems could no longer create schedules with a built-in assumption that doctors will work through lunch and do 2 hours of clerical work for each 1 hour of patient contact time? Claiming responsibility and tackling these very fundamental broken elements of the healthcare culture is a monster threat to the leadership. I mean, we have to decide what is the capability and vision of the current leadership team. And I'm not dissing yoga or journaling. I love that stuff. That's not the point. But the compulsive measurement and remeasurement of burnout year after year while installing solutions to shore up the physicians is like dusting off that gasping soot-covered canary, giving it a few resilience tips, and sending it back down into the mine to try a little harder. Another area of controversy is whether burnout is even the right framework for what's happening with physicians and the medical profession. Is there a more accurate category to describe the harm being done? Two physicians raised the question of whether moral injury is more accurate. Doctors Wendy Dean and Simon Talbot, who both experienced burnout themselves, think it is. Moral injury refers to the harm done when someone's in a situation of not being able to meet their own professional or ethical standards. And it hurts people. It hurts patients. Doctors Dean and Talbot, a psychiatrist and a surgeon, said that they knew how best to care for their patients, but were blocked from doing so by systemic barriers related to the business side of healthcare. They described the trauma being done to physicians who succumb to the influence of a pernicious system that doesn't share the professional values of physicians. A pernicious system that, rather than support doing the right thing, constructs barriers to doing the right thing. Another prominent naysayer when it comes to using the term burnout is Dr. Pamela Weibel. She's the founder and proponent of Ideal Clinics, an alternative practice structure that supports physicians to run their own independent practices. Dr. Weibel is also a relentless advocate for medical students, residents, and physicians. She's particularly passionate about doing whatever she can to reduce the number of medical students and residents who die by suicide. She's run a suicide hotline for doctors for 8 years. She gives out her phone number. And with the COVID-19 disaster, she's opened up her hotline to nurses as well. Dr. Weibel has a little different definition of burnout. She says burnout is bullshit. She said that what's being called burnout is actually human rights violations. And she wrote a book titled Human Rights Violations in Medicine, A to Z Action Guide. It's an important reframing of what is often sadly accepted, sometimes tragically accepted, as just business as usual, particularly during medical school and residency. She adamantly rejects the ongoing use of the word burnout. Quote, physician burnout is the most popular victim-blaming buzzword used to make medical professionals question their self-worth while distracting attention from the medical system that has perpetrated human rights violations on physicians, close quote. Take a look at Dr. Weibel's website, idealmedicalcare.org. This woman is a wonder and doesn't give one hot damn if we like her pink hearts, her running monitor of physician and medical student suicides, or her passionate defense of people doing their best to care for patients in a hostile work environment. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, no less than the World Health Organization agrees with Dr. Weibel on the source of burnout, if not the precise wording. They decline to include bullshit in their definition, but the language that's going into the next International Classification of Diseases, IDC-11, does define burnout as an occupational phenomenon. In addition to the World Health Organization, someone else who agrees with Dr. Weibel is Christina Maslach. She clearly believes burnout is caused by factors in the work environment. She wasn't even happy about having the syndrome included in the ICD-11. She says including it there, even with the World Health Organization's careful explanation, seems to imply that it's a disease, which implicates the person, not the workplace. Dr. Weibel, in addition to writing a book to help doctors navigate human rights violations in medicine, has also published a book of letters written by medical students and physicians who died by suicide. While I've read and appreciate the A to Z guide of human rights violations, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to read a book of suicide letters. Dr. Weibel says, quote, naturally, medical institutions would rather celebrate their new chief wellness officer and meditation garden than take responsibility for these human rights violations against their own physicians and trainees. Denial and avoidance only perpetuate abuse, leading to more suicides, close quote. I agree with Dr. Weibel that there are human rights violations, particularly in medical school and residency, and particularly when the balance of power so clearly subjugates the student or resident to anyone higher in the pecking order, and to anyone who has input into their evaluations. The ordeal of medical school academics is a crushing avalanche of information, a non-evidence-based gauntlet that lays a foundation of exhaustion and fear. And residents endure abuse of power and exploitation while providing cheap hospital labor. Great harm is done with all the outcomes of burnout: medical error, abandoned careers, failed marriages, suicide. In addition, turning a blind eye to these abuses is a setup for physicians to continue to tolerate intolerable conditions, a form of learned helplessness that bleeds into future workplaces. In an article titled Physician Burnout and Occupational Stress, an Inconvenient Truth with Unintended Consequences, the authors have this to say about medical training. Quote, this cultural training makes individuals less likely to realize the unreasonable level of expectation that incrementally has accumulated, close quote, all of which helps to perpetuate accepting toxic cultures as normal. Human rights violations isn't the umbrella term that I would use to describe many other parts of healthcare culture that need to be addressed. Many examples are lousy leadership, but not really human rights violations, like the opportunistic conception and implementation of the EHR, although death by 1,000 clicks might qualify, and lame recruiting and selection processes, lack of leadership development, confusion of authority in matrixed or dyad models of healthcare, uncoordinated quality metrics from multiple sources. Sadly, these examples are legion. I do think that human rights violations, which are especially applicable to medical students and residents, are by far the most urgent. On Drs. Dean and Talbot's preference for the term moral injury, I agree when they state, quote, we believe that burnout is itself a symptom of something larger, our broken healthcare system, close quote. Indeed. Physicians are controlled and hogtied by profit-oriented interests and barriers, whether it's exhausting hoops that doctors have to jump through to get an effective drug, or shortchanging patients by not giving them full attention while we're busy clicking on all the right boxes. When the exhausted physician quits trying to overcome the barriers, and especially if the physician's decision leads to a bad outcome, the patient is harmed, but so is the physician, and that harm is a moral injury. I remember a 20-year-old patient who came in to see me because of a headache late one afternoon. I was running 40 minutes behind. I examined her but didn't find anything specific to hang my hat on. But something must have bugged me about the situation because I thought about ordering a stat head CT. Her exam was normal and she was nice and even apologetic for squeezing into my schedule. But something didn't seem typical. I don't know. Anyway, I just couldn't or wouldn't deal with the barriers, the phone calls, the logistics, the pushback that I knew I'd get if I tried to get a stat head CT on a 20-year-old for a headache. I couldn't imagine spending the time in that frustrating effort while I got further behind. I told her to go to the ER if it got worse. And then when I called to check on her the next day, she'd left town with her parents to go to her brother's graduation. 10 days later, her mom called to tell me that her daughter had been hospitalized out of state with an intracranial bleeding inside her brain, a 20-year-old. That was a couple of decades ago. And can you hear how many details of that event I can remember? I mean, I don't have a great memory. I've had college roommates I don't remember, apparently. Anyway, this was a moral injury. I chose me instead of shoving through the hassle factor. A few years later, when I was leading orientation programs, I made a point to tell this story during orientation for new physicians, to encourage them to push through the barriers so their patients and they wouldn't have a similar experience. Now, in retrospect, in addition to coaching physicians to be empowered to do whatever it takes to shove through barriers, I wish I would have mightily questioned why there were any barriers to push through in the first place. Clearly, that would have been a better target for my efforts. Okay, before I move on to the data about the impact of burnout on physicians, there are a couple of other areas of controversy about burnout. The first one is some ongoing sparring about whether it's even justified to define burnout separately from depression. Researchers Schoenfeld and Bianchi make an articulate argument in the Journal of Clinical Psychology titled, Burnout or Depression, Two Entities or One? They argue that burnout is a form of depression, given the overlap between the two. And in a book chapter about burnout, they expand their argument and say they believe what's needed is conceptual parsimony. In other words, not creating two syndromes where one will do. There is something to be said for that, considering that burnout sounds a lot like what's been called situational depression. And we know that's supposed to be caused by external circumstances. Maslach rebutted this idea in a 2016 World Psychiatry article, quote, "For those claiming that the states of depression and burnout are indistinguishable, this position is in contrast to the view that burnout is an occupationally specific dysphoria that is distinct from depression. Depression is a broadly based mental illness," close quote. When all the dust settles, Schoenfeld and Bianchi could be correct, but if we think burnout is a radioactive term for the callous, abusive, counterproductive workplace practices, just imagine calling it depression. While it might be exacting and parsimonious to categorize it that way for those who are studying the impact on people, using terms loaded with stigma does more harm than good as far as fixing this problem, which is really where we have to go. As Dr. Weibel states, quote, "Despite medicine's obsession with measuring physician burnout for nearly 4 decades, the epidemic of physician cynicism, exhaustion, and despair is worsening," close quote. She has a point about all the measuring, or as one writer cautiously stated, quote, "It's time to move past quantification and get to an investigation of what will reduce the incidence of burnout," close quote. The legacy so far of those who study and publish the most about burnout is weirdly circumspect on the source of the problem. To me, this is like someone roaming the street, bashing people over the head with a baseball bat. But then all the talk and investigation is all about the size of the defect in the skull and the fragility of the tissues, that unfortunate dent in the head, and the inventory of problems attributed to this skull deficiency, including death. And the head bashing continues. So we continue to track the skull defects over time and write articles with headlines like, "Are skull defects on the downswing?" Anyway, I invite you to think about that, and I'll circle back at the end of this podcast series after we look at more of the burnout data, and I'll ask for ideas about how to shift the spotlight in an effective way to the causative agents. The final area of controversy about, yes, I kind of cringe as I even use the word burnout. Anyway, the final area of controversy is the Maslach burnout inventory itself. The MBI has been criticized because it has 3 domains that are not additive. They're not equal in weight, and any one of the 3 domains can be used to define the presence of burnout. I think that sort of thing is unusual in nosology. Nosology is the branch of medical science dealing with the classification of diseases. And having 3 independent domains, any one of which can define the syndrome, and all 3 of which are imbalanced with each other, will drive people like the researchers Schoenfeld and Bianchi nuts. But then you have to say to yourself, wait, we're not even supposed to be talking about a disease. We're talking about an occupationally induced syndrome. So why mention nosology? Because that's the classification of diseases. Watch me dance through this nomenclature nightmare. You have to stay light on your feet navigating this territory. Anyway, the dominance of the first domain, exhaustion, and the weakness of the third domain, inefficacy, is a problem. Most critics say inefficacy does not warrant its own domain and is not a necessary part of the definition. Others complain that the MBI is too long, and then yet others reject how the questions are worded or scored. Other burnout assessments have been developed to address all of these issues, but the MBI continues to be the gold standard. So to address this issue of a weak third domain and an overly long survey, other MBI versions have been used, truncated versions to say the least. The third domain is whacked off altogether, say goodbye to inefficacy, and then the most highly correlated item from each of the first 2 domains, exhaustion and cynicism, is used. So the 2-item version has the emotional exhaustion item, I feel burned out from my work, and the cynicism item, I have become more callous toward people since I took this job. And this 2-item version is actually highly predictive of responses on the full 22-item MBI. And for those people who simply cannot imagine imposing on people with a 2-item survey, there is also a 1-item burnout survey. It's a question that was developed for ease of use and to avoid the proprietary fees associated with the Maslach burnout inventory. This single question survey asks, overall, based on your definition of burnout, how would you rate your level of burnout? And then the respondent can pick from a 5-option Likert scale. Okay, let's move off the controversies and on to the data regarding the current state of physician burnout and factors that create this mayhem. Part 3, physician burnout data and more. Burnout is frequently described as an epidemic, but what's the definition of an epidemic? I'm sorry this is so timely right now. It's always a surprise to go looking for a simple answer to what seems to be a black and white question, and then realize you've Googled your way into a subterranean controversy. I found snarky articles bemoaning how the word epidemic is misused, and I even skimmed another article taking us all the way back to Homer and the ancient Greeks. So anyway, I went to the CDC website, which says epidemic refers to an increase, often sudden, in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in that population in that area. So has there been a sudden increase? The rate's been around 40 or 50%. No obvious trend to me. Is it, quote, above what is normally expected, close quote? That's a tough question. The general population burnout rate is around 28%. So tracking along with the definition of an epidemic, an increase, often sudden, in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in that population in that area, I think about 50% is what's normally expected. If physician burnout was suddenly 28%, it would mean something dramatic had just happened. So I expect a physician burnout rate of about 50%, don't you? I mean, that's where it's been, and it's safe to say that rate has been impervious to the yoga, incense, and resilience interventions. The rate is very high, but it's not above what is normally expected in that population. So no, given all that, I don't think this is an epidemic. But I found another word on the CDC website that I think is closer to the mark: hyperendemic. This means a sustained high level of a disease within a certain population. Hyperendemic. You're welcome. Let's look at the stats on burnout among physicians. Before I launch into some of the data, 2 brief items. Number 1, there's a physician burnout research dynasty in the United States. It's at the Mayo Clinic, and the crown prince has been Tate Shanafelt, MD. He is the lead author, a contributing author, or author of at least one of the first 5 references in every article on burnout. If you are clutching an article and that's not the case, throw your article away. Dr. Shanafelt defected from Mayo to Stanford in 2017, where he is now hailed as the first chief wellness officer at an academic medical center. The second item to note is about the data on burnout. It's a frustrating effort to try to put your hands on hard and fast burnout data for a specific year and a specific group because of the various ways burnout is measured. Even the same data set is mined for burnout data based just on one domain or on 2 domains or even on 3. And then all those different rates are published as the burnout rate. And there are reasons for it, but you probably don't feel my pain here. But my experience was corroborated by Scott W. Yates, who wrote a 2019 article titled Physician Stress and Burnout. And he launches the whole article with this statement, quote, research regarding physician burnout is plagued by large variability in reported prevalence rates and a lack of agreed terminology, close quote. That's for sure. Okay, back to the studies. Shanafelt has documented through the years that physicians have significantly higher burnout than the general population. And he found that the more years of education for someone in the general population, the less burnout risk they have, except when it comes to physicians. The MD or DO is not protective like other advanced degrees, and it actually has a much higher risk of burnout beyond those with just a high school education. In 2014, the general population burnout rate was 28%, and the rate of burnout in physicians was 21 percentage points higher at 49%. And in 2017, he compared physicians to PhDs and other professionals, and the PhDs, et cetera, had a burnout rate of 29%, and physicians had a burnout rate of 40%. And they corrected for work hours when comparing the 2 groups. Speaking of work hours, if you just look at the number of people who work more than 60 hours a week, you'll find that 11 to 13% of the general population, and this includes people with advanced degrees, but not physicians, 11 to 13% work more than 60 hours a week. And 39% of physicians work more than 60 hours per week. 13% versus 39%. And we've got the doctors doing pajama time with the electronic health record every night. So back to the matter at hand. Why do highly educated people have less burnout with their PhDs, et cetera, but physicians are not protected in the same way with our MD or DO degrees? I suspect that other professionals who attain a high level of education earn autonomy along with that diploma. Physicians, on the other hand, first of all, have less autonomy. They are remarkably constrained in their ability to control the content of their work, the management of their staff, their schedules. And when I say remarkably constrained, it verges on understatement, depending on the medical specialty and the organization. And then secondly, in contrast to other professionals, my theory is that physicians themselves and their patients and the public have a much higher expectation for physician autonomy. So there's this big gap between the expectation and the reality of a physician's autonomy. If someone's authority is not commensurate with their level of accountability, it's a huge threat to autonomy and a potential source of burnout. Okay, back to the current data. There's a recent survey that's titled the Medscape National Physician Burnout and Suicide Report 2020. Yikes, what a title. More than 15,000 physicians responded to this survey, which reports on burnout by specialty and demographic categories. The 2020 data showed an overall burnout rate of 42%, with the three highest burnout rates in urology at 54%, neurology at 50%, and nephrology at 49%. The surgical specialties, as well as psychiatry and preventive medicine, were on the other end of the spectrum, with rates of burnout at or below 35%. While every survey seems to create a flurry of speculation about increasing or decreasing physician burnout rates, I would agree with a comment that Medscape included in this report from a Yale physician, Frank John Ninivaggi. Quote, "The percentage of physicians feeling burned out remains fairly consistent. The leading cause is administrative burden, as driven by the workplace and organizational culture," close quote. Female physicians, as well as Generation X or Gen X physicians, have higher burnout rates of 48%. The Gen X physicians are about 40 to 55 years old in 2020. The younger docs, the millennials, and the older docs, the boomers, have burnout rates of 38%. So that mid-career swath of docs and female physicians are about 10 percentage points higher. And this is thought to be due to a peak of responsibility both at work and at home with kids and parents to look after. Although I don't really know why female physicians would be higher like that. What would it be about being at the peak of responsibility for both work and home with kids and parents to look after that would affect women? Can't figure that one out. Okay, kidding. So what is the generation called after the millennials? I'm sure you can't help but ask. Well, they've been called Generation Z or Gen Z or the iGen, as in iPhone. And they were born between 1996 and 2010. So the oldest of the iGen is just entering medical school, and Medscape is silent on that bunch. Okay, sorry about that little diversion, but maybe I was avoiding this next piece. According to the 2020 Medscape survey, 22% of physicians have had suicidal ideation, and 1 to 2% have attempted suicide. Approximately 400 physicians per year commit suicide, more than one physician a day. The suicide rate among male physicians is 40% higher than the general population, and among female physicians, it's 120% higher than the general population. In the next podcast, I'll talk more about all the effects of burnout, and I'll look more closely at how it is that our healers take their own lives at twice the rate of the general population. For now, though, let's look more closely at burnout in medical students and residents. In podcast number 2, I talked about myths about physicians, stereotypes repeated over and over until the next thing you know, it's in the water. Like doctors are lousy leaders or lousy at managing their money, when in fact, data shows us that physicians are pretty top-notch at both of those. Well, another myth that needs to be busted is the idea that people who go into medicine are prone to burnout and depression. Because our perfectionism and neuroticism and control freakiness predicts this kind of outcome. That's also fake news. So a study with lead author Chantal Brazeau looked at the mental health of incoming students in a 2014 academic medicine journal article titled Distress Among Matriculating Medical Students Relative to the General Population. They surveyed almost 600 students from around the country and found the rate of burnout of students about to enter medical school was 27%, compared to age-matched controls at 37%. And compared to students already in medical school who had a burnout rate of 49%. Yikes, 49% after finally achieving their dream, their hard-earned place in medical school. The researcher also looked at suicidal ideation. Incoming students had a suicidal ideation rate of 2.5%. Students already in medical school had a rate of 11.2%. So, medical students poised to enter school have significantly lower rates of burnout and depression than a control group. But once in medical school, the rate of burnout goes up 22 percentage points and suicidal ideation quadruples. The authors say, quote, "This apparent shift from students being at lower risk of distress at the time they begin medical school to higher risk during medical school and at all subsequent stages of their career support the contention that being a physician is a high-risk profession," close quote. Yes, indeed. Also, I found this interesting. Apparently, the authors were privy to the fact that the Association of American Medical Colleges was thinking about identifying some specific competencies for recruiting medical students. So the authors included advice to help the AAMC address this burnout issue. Quote, "One tempting approach could be to develop admission criteria that evaluate applicants' resilience in order to screen out individuals potentially at high risk for burnout. We would advise caution against a strategy that overemphasizes selection of resilient individuals capable of navigating a dysfunctional training process. Instead, we should address the problems within the learning environment that precipitate burnout in highly talented and dedicated individuals with the traits desired in future physicians," close quote. The inclusion of that admonishment makes this a real outlier among the "just the facts, ma'am" publications coming from Tate and the gang at Mayo. Yes, he was a co-author on this 2014 article. But back to the issue. Do you know what we do to medical students? Great harm. Here's an excerpt from a quote Pamela Weibel shared from a third-year medical student. Quote, "On paper, I'm successful, yet I find myself thinking about killing myself, walking into traffic, jumping through the window, miserable thoughts. I saw the school psychiatrist who looked just as broken as I felt. I never felt this way before medical school. I loved, I thought, I reflected, I enjoyed being creative, yet now I'm chained by procedure, bureaucracy, and paperwork. There are no creative solutions to problems. There's no effective effort to improve the system," close quote. This harm being done to medical students is habit and inertia. It's not science. There's no evidence to support the ringer that we drag medical students through. Nicholas Jagmauer wrote an article titled "Depression and the Toxic Learning Environment in Graduate Medical Education." He surveyed 12,000 residents and fellows to assess them for depression, and he asked questions to find out if they had been belittled or humiliated at work in the previous 2 weeks. 27% of the residents reported at least one instance of being belittled or humiliated within 2 weeks of completing the survey. Jagmauer found that those with at least one incident of being belittled or humiliated in the previous 2 weeks were 4.6 times more likely to screen positive for depression, with males more likely than females to screen positive for depression in this scenario. The author cautiously states, quote, "In this report, the high association between resident mistreatment and depression suggests that decreasing the prevalence of resident mistreatment may have a positive impact on the mental health of residents," close quote. Yes, I bet it would. We take medical students who have worked extraordinarily hard to get to the door of medical school and who stand there at that threshold mentally healthier than their peers. And within a few months, they become emotionally depleted with a 4 times greater rate of suicidal ideation than they had before medical school. And half of them meet criteria for burnout. We continue this interesting intervention during residency and fellowship, and it leads to horrendous outcomes like depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide, and it has broader impacts on career choice. We're in desperate need of more family medicine physicians and general internists, but with predatory levels of medical student debt and a disproportionate, and I'd say disrespectful level of data entry expected, it's not reasonable. It's not healthy for someone to choose family medicine or general internal medicine. it's abundantly clear during training that those career choices not only pay less, which is untenable with the amount of debt from medical school, but they're also the environments that seem most likely to continue the subjugation experienced during training. Trainees also face a no mistakes allowed culture, and they face loneliness, all in the context of difficulty accessing confidential and affordable mental health care. Our future physicians are truly, truly put in harm's way. So medical school deans are not finding a way to protect these wonderful, often brilliant, originally mentally healthy humans in their medical school. Is it a lack of concern, a lack of power, a lack of passion? What? Let's take a look at what the research tells us are the biggest causes of burnout. The Medscape 2020 survey of 15,000 physicians overwhelmingly points to bureaucratic tasks like charting and paperwork as far and away the number one cause of burnout. 55% of physicians point to mindless clerical work as the biggest source of stress. There are inventories of the sources of burnout, and the frequent flyers are the electronic health record with its poor usability, a high workload with long work hours and time pressure but no recovery time, chaotic work environments, lack of control over work, and values dissonance, which prioritizes corporate profits over care of patients. Physicians face an array of competing and overlapping financial interests, often generated by non-physicians, that interfere with physician decision-making and create mandates for work design and workflow and so-called efficiencies, crazy-making but common scenarios that send support staff home based on a time clock and then redefine clerical work as physicians' work. Dr. Danielle Ofri, a clinical professor at New York University School of Medicine, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times that was titled, "The Business of Healthcare Depends on Exploiting Doctors and Nurses." She stated, "By now, corporate medicine has milked just about all the efficiency it can out of the system. But one resource that seems endless and free is the professional ethic of medical staff members." I'll provide a link to Dr. Ofri's eloquent article in the show notes. So a laundry list of causative factors doesn't really serve us that well, but what does serve us well is the 2013 RAND study sponsored by the AMA. It is titled Factors Affecting Physician Professional Satisfaction and Their Implications for Patient Care, Health Systems, and Health Policy. This 152-page tome gave us everything we needed to know back in 2013. There are 10 main findings, but the authors highlight 2 critical findings. They are, number 1, physician dissatisfaction is attributable to physicians being thwarted in their attempts to provide high-quality care. So nope, it wasn't income, it wasn't workload, it wasn't even healthcare regulations. It was not being able to do what physicians have been superbly trained to do and not being able to do what they are hired and expected to do and what patients ask them to do, provide high quality care. As the lead author, Dr. Mark Friedberg said, quote, "Physicians describe feeling stressed and unhappy when they see barriers preventing them from providing quality care," close quote. The authors point out that interventions that address these quality concerns, quote, "should be attractive to multiple stakeholders," close quote. Reading between the lines, I heard, stop accusing the docs of making self-centered demands when what really matters to them is high-quality patient care, and that should matter to everyone, so pay attention. The second finding that the authors thought novel and important was that the EHR was a significant source of dissatisfaction. Now realize that this was a big statement back in 2013. They found that physicians, along with pretty much everyone else, approved of the potential of electronic records, but the reality of the existing EHR with its myriad deficiencies was a significant source of dissatisfaction. I'll revisit the RAND AMA survey on this point in podcast number 7. I had such high hopes when this came out in 2013. I somehow felt vindicated by the findings that docs weren't complaining in a self-serving way. Their frustration was based, number one, on being thwarted in fulfilling their professional obligations to patients, and number two, in dealing with the epic failure that is the EHR. I waited alertly, watching for a tsunami of concern and innovation and fervor to address these findings. But alas, when you consider the lists of dysfunctional and abusive elements that medical students and physicians deal with at work, you get this sense of a toxic brew that students wade into on day one of medical school, get in deeper during residency, and depending on their specialty choice and the leaders of whatever healthcare organization they end up in, about 50% of them will be in it for the duration. The muck of emotional exhaustion and cynicism and loss of their sense of efficacy or capability. The COVID-19 pandemic is giving a bigger audience a view of healthcare culture, amazing and courageous leadership, as well as leadership whose image-conscious and financially driven priorities more than reveal their lack of respect for physicians, nurses, and their teams. COVID-19 is highlighting the inspiring and phenomenal work of physicians, nurses, emergency workers, and everyone else rushing in to care for people. If there can be a positive outcome, I hope it will be utter clarity about the need for excellent, expert physician leadership at every level in our healthcare systems. Next up, I'll wrap up this podcast with a request. Thank you for joining me in navigating through burnout's definition and the data. Many of you have experienced burnout, however you choose to define it. Would you tell me about your experiences in a toxic culture and then what you experienced when you left? I'd also like to hear any other comments you might have, and especially if you're in a culture where things are going well, especially during this bizarre and frightening world with the COVID-19 disaster. Can you tell me about a hospital or an organization where the need to invest in people is understood? Are your leaders getting it right? I'll use some of your ideas and comments in future podcasts on this topic. And if you give me permission, I may use your voice. Leave me a message on the app on my podcast page. It's a tab that says send voicemail. It can even be anonymous. All this is at licensedtoleadpodcast.com, where you'll also find the show notes. In the next podcast episode, number 5, I'll look at the effect of burnout on the lives and careers of physicians and nurses and the impact on patients, healthcare, and of course, finances. That's a wrap on episode number 4 of the License to Lead podcast. Thank you for joining me and listening in. And most of all, thank you as always for all of your care and caring. To learn more about how we work with physicians and other leaders to create healthy work cultures, or to join in the conversation for future podcasts, go to licensedtoleadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or leave me a voice message.